A battle-hardened veteran rescues a helpless baby goat, only to realize he's brought something far more dangerous into his home. The creature watches, learns, and adapts, hiding behind innocent eyes while fear spreads through the walls. But when Tom uncovers a long-buried military secret and faces the truth head-on, he makes a choice no soldier should have to make. And just wait until you hear the chilling twist that turned this nightmare around, and why justice, in the end, found its way back through the woods. For the past 8 years, Tom Gallagher had asked for nothing from the world, only that it leave him alone. He had traded sandstorms for pine trees, sirens for silence. After serving 3 combat tours as a Marine, Tom had returned to a country that barely looked him in the eye. So he vanished, retreating into the Appalachian wilderness, where he built a life carved from quiet routines and unspoken grief. His only companion was Shadow, a black German shepherd with eyes that scanned like radars and instincts that never dulled. Tom had rescued him from a shelter 5 winters ago, but in truth, it was Shadow who saved him. They were 2 survivors, bound not by words, but by something deeper. Each morning, they hiked a loop through the woods. No paths, no noise, just frost on leaves, wind in the trees, and the soft rhythm of boots and paws over damp soil. But this morning was different. The fog was heavier than usual, clinging to the treetops like a warning. The air was still, too still, the kind of quiet that made birds forget to sing. Shadow walked ahead as always, ears perked, steps careful. Then, 20 yards from the ridge, he froze. Not a sound. Tom stopped, hand instinctively brushing the handle of the old hunting knife on his belt. Shadow's body tensed like a wire drawn tight. His ears tilted. Then came a noise, faint, broken, almost too soft to register. A bleat. At first, Tom thought it was his memory playing tricks on him. A branch maybe, wind through a hollow. But then it came again. A dry, trembling cry. A baby goat, out here. Shadow turned his head slowly toward the trees. His lips curled slightly. Not a snarl, not quite. It was a low, uncertain growl, as if he wasn't angry, but deeply unsettled. Tom whispered, "Easy." He followed the sound through the underbrush, brushing aside ferns and brittle twigs. And then he saw it. A small white shape, curled against the base of a dying oak tree. Mud-caked, trembling, ribs pressing through its skin with each shiver. It was a goat, but barely. No mother in sight, no tracks around it. Just there. As if it had been dropped out of the sky. Tom crouched beside it. Its eyes were half-lidded, breathing was shallow. Flies already buzzed at its legs. Every instinct told him it wasn't going to make it another hour. Shadow stood 10 feet away, unmoving. He didn't approach, didn't sniff. Instead, he gave another quiet growl, then looked at Tom with eyes that seemed to say, "Don't." But Tom had seen this before, not in animals, but in people, in children pulled from rubble, in farmers staring blankly at burning fields, in brothers who didn't make it home. There was something about the way the goat just lay there, not fighting, not pleading, just waiting. Waiting for someone to choose whether it lived or not. Tom reached down and slid his arms underneath its fragile frame. Shadow whined. "I know," Tom said, barely a whisper. He stood up with the goat pressed to his chest. It was lighter than expected, bones more than body. The fog was lifting now, but the cold still clung to the trees like a ghost. As Tom turned back toward the trail, Shadow didn't move. The dog stood there, rigid, eyes locked, not on the goat, but on the tree behind it. Tom glanced over his shoulder. There was nothing there. But Shadow didn't blink the rest of the way home. Tom named her Pixie. It was half joke, half habit. She was so small, almost weightless, and the name came to him unbidden, like a fragment from some forgotten storybook. But the longer Pixie stayed in the cabin, the less innocent the name felt. She was quiet, too quiet. Not in the way sick animals conserve their strength, but in a way that felt deliberate. She never made a sound, no bleats, no stomps, not even the occasional sneeze or rustle of hooves. She moved like mist, barely disturbing her surroundings, as though she was always aware of how much space she took up. And somehow, it was never much. Tom had prepared warm milk in bottles, as any farmer would with a rescued newborn. But Pixie never took to them. She sniffed once, then turned away without complaint. Yet she never lost weight, never weakened, and still she never cried from hunger. Shadow didn't take it well. The dog refused to eat in the same room as her. He wouldn't lie down near the fire if Pixie was there. He kept a wide berth, always watching, always alert. Sometimes, late at night, Tom would find Shadow sitting just outside the small room where Pixie slept, eyes locked on the half-open door, body trembling not from cold, but from something older, deeper, instinct. Tom tried to shake it off. Dogs were sensitive. Maybe Shadow sensed the animal's weakness or something else Tom couldn't see. Maybe the unease was his own, and Shadow was simply mirroring it. But then the strange things started happening. At first, they were subtle. A spoon left on the counter would be found on the floor. A light that had been switched off would be back on in the morning. One evening, Tom came back from chopping firewood to find his boots in the wrong corner of the room. Nothing dramatic, just slightly wrong. He told himself he was tired, getting older, things slip. But on the third night, as a cold wind stirred through the hills, something changed. It was after midnight. Tom had just finished reading by the fire and was headed to bed when Shadow started to whimper at the front door. Not bark, not scratch, just a soft, mournful sound Tom had never heard from him before. "Want to go out?" Tom asked. But Shadow didn't move toward the door. He backed away from it, slowly, as if whatever was behind it wasn't something he wanted to chase, but something he feared might come in. Tom paused, unsettled. He turned the deadbolt, drew the curtain shut, and muttered to himself, "It's just a wind." But as he crossed the living room, a sharp crack startled him. He turned to see a photo frame lying face down on the floor, the one from his mantel, the only photo he still kept out, the one of his unit, taken just weeks before the incident in Helmand. The glass was intact, but the fall had left a deep scratch down the middle, right across his own face. He stared at it for a long time before setting it aside. Maybe the vibration from the wind, maybe nothing. That night, he didn't sleep well. A few days passed. The air inside the cabin grew heavier, like humidity without heat. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. And sometimes, Tom would catch Pixie staring at things that weren't there. Corners of the room, blank walls, empty windows. Just staring, motionless, for minutes at a time. Midweek, the worst came. Tom awoke suddenly in the middle of the night. His sheets were damp with sweat, his heart was pounding, and he didn't know why. The room was cold, silent, but he could have sworn he'd heard a voice. Not words, not language, just a whisper, something thin and wet and far too close to his ear. The kind of whisper you don't hear, but feel, just beneath the surface of your thoughts, like a hand brushing the back of your neck in the dark. He sat up, breathing hard. And then he saw her. Pixie was standing at the foot of his bed. Not lying, not curled up, standing, perfectly still. Her eyes didn't reflect the soft lamplight like a normal animal's would. They seemed to absorb it, deep, dull, and empty. She was staring directly at him. Tom's first instinct was to reach for the flashlight. He flicked it on, blinked. But when the light filled the room,
Pixie hadn't moved, not an inch, just standing, watching. He called softly, "Pixie?" No response, no sound, nothing. Tom swung his legs over the bed and stood, slowly. His every step creaked across the wooden floor as he moved toward her. But by the time he reached her, Pixie lowered her head and quietly walked away, like it had been an accident, like it had meant nothing. Tom watched as she disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. But that night, he didn't go back to sleep. And neither did Shadow.
Tom Gallagher had learned long ago to trust what he could see and question what he could feel. And lately, something didn't feel right. The unease that had crept into his cabin wasn't going away. If anything, it was growing. The air inside the house felt thick, like it was listening. Even Shadow had changed. The confident shepherd who once barked at bears now avoided certain corners of the home entirely, especially near Pixie. Tom's instincts, sharpened by years in places where misreading a situation could mean the end, finally pushed him to act. He started with the obvious. Early that Saturday morning, he loaded Shadow into the truck, left Pixie curled in a pile of hay in the barn, and drove 20 miles into the nearest town, a small community where people still waved to each other in the grocery store and everyone knew who raised what. He asked quietly, casually, if anyone had lost a goat. Most said no. A few looked at him strangely, amused that he'd bother with something so small. "No one round here breeds dwarfs, and certainly not this time of year," said an older farmer named Ray, scratching his chin. "Might have been dumped, I guess, but we'd have heard something." Tom asked if anyone had seen strange tracks in the woods, strange sounds, anyone missing dogs, cattle. Just more head shakes, a few chuckles. No, nothing out of the ordinary. Still unsettled, Tom didn't give up. Back at the edge of town, he stopped at the vet clinic, a modest building tucked between an antique store and a post office, its windows lined with faded posters about tick season and winter care. Dr. Laura Briggs had known Tom for years. She'd treated Shadow's leg when he tore a ligament chasing a fox 3 winters ago. She trusted him, but even she raised an eyebrow when he handed her a sealed plastic vial and said, "I need a quick blood analysis. Just curiosity." He lied, of course, said he'd found a rare pygmy breed, maybe crossbred with something exotic. She agreed to run the test and call him in a couple days. Tom drove home, trying to push the doubt out of his head. But the next night, the situation with Shadow worsened. He began to pace, not restlessly, but with purpose. He circled the cabin 3 times before finally lying down near the front door, refusing to sleep. Every hour, he'd rise and growl toward the barn. Tom tried to calm him. "She's just an animal, nothing more." But Shadow didn't blink, didn't move. And then came Monday. At exactly 7:42 a.m., Tom's phone rang. It was Dr. Briggs. She didn't waste time. "Tom, what exactly did you bring me?" "What do you mean?" "I've rerun the sample twice. This blood, it's not right. I don't mean contaminated. I mean it doesn't match anything. Not goats, not sheep, not even wild species in this region. The cellular structure is inconsistent. The markers are off. I need to ask again, what kind of animal are we talking about?" Tom's throat tightened. "Just a goat," he replied. A long pause on the other end. Then, with an edge of concern in her voice, Laura said, "Well, I'm not sure what you've got in that barn, but I wouldn't keep it near your dog." She hung up before he could ask anything else. That evening, the tension finally snapped. Shadow lunged at the barn door, teeth bared, barking furiously. Tom raced outside to find him clawing at the wood, not out of rage, but out of fear. His fur stood on end, his legs were trembling. When Tom opened the latch, Shadow didn't go inside. He stayed frozen in the doorway. Pixie stood in the center of the barn, silent. Her head was tilted ever so slightly.
Her eyes, as always, didn't reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Shadow let out a guttural growl and took a single step forward. Pixie didn't move. Then Shadow barked again, louder, desperate, and lunged. Tom had to physically drag him back by the collar. The dog thrashed once, then stopped. His chest heaved. His eyes locked on Pixie with a look Tom had never seen in him before. Terror. And Pixie? She just blinked. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room with his rifle leaning against the wall and a cup of cold coffee in his hands. He didn't turn the lights off. He didn't close the barn door. 2 days later, the pattern took its final turn. Tom had driven in town to pick up supplies, feed for Shadow, batteries, and a new trail cam he'd been meaning to install. The trip took 2 hours round trip. When he returned, something was wrong. The yard was a mess, tools scattered, a spade half buried in the mud. The firewood pile, which he had stacked carefully just that morning, was knocked over. It looked almost like an animal had ransacked the area, except nothing was missing, just disordered. But the worst was the door. His cabin's wooden front door, once smooth and weather-worn, now bore 3 deep claw marks, vertical, straight, and evenly spaced. They spelled one thing, unmistakably: Tom. No initials, no guesswork. Just his name, gouged into the wood like a message. And no prints, no hair, no sign of intrusion, nothing. Tom stepped back, breath catching in his throat. On the porch, lying calmly in the exact center of the welcome mat, was Pixie. She was staring straight at him, not blinking, not afraid, just waiting. And in that moment, Tom no longer believed he had brought something helpless into his home. Something had come there on its own. Tom Gallagher had known fear. Not the kind most people talk about, not the jump scares or the nervous shakes before a speech. Real fear. The kind that sinks into your spine when you're pinned down behind a crumbling wall, hearing metal whistle through the air and wondering if the next breath you take will be your last. But this was different. What settled over his home now wasn't adrenaline, it was ice. A cold, gnawing sensation that something was wrong not just in his world, but in the fabric of what he understood to be real. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the living room with Shadow beside him, the dog pressed tight against his feet. The rifle rested across Tom's lap, chambered and ready, just like it had been on long, sleepless nights overseas. But this wasn't a war zone. This was his land, his sanctuary, and it had been infiltrated. Earlier that day, Tom had mounted one of his spare trail cams inside the barn rafters. He told himself it was just for peace of mind, but deep down, he knew what he was doing. He wasn't trying to catch a raccoon or a wandering coyote. He was waiting for confirmation, and it came. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the monitor on his desk flickered. Tom hadn't taken his eyes off it for hours, but what he saw made his pulse skip. Pixie was moving. Not walking, not pacing. She stood, slowly, rising up from the straw in the corner of the barn. At first, it looked like a trick of shadow and motion blur, but the figure kept going, higher than a goat should, much higher. Her front legs extended down like arms. Her spine arched in a way that no animal's back was built to move. Her neck lengthened, vertebra by vertebra, until her head was nearly touching the rafter above. And then her eyes opened. Gone were the dull, silent eyes of the creature he had rescued. These were pools of black, bottomless, still, and deliberate. The camera lens caught the light just enough to highlight the unnatural depth. For a moment, she simply stood there. Then her head turned, not toward the barn door, not toward a noise, but toward the camera, hidden 20 feet up in the corner, tucked behind an old beam. She stared directly into it. Shadow, watching beside Tom, let out a bark so sharp and sudden it almost knocked the rifle from his lap. His fur bristled. He backed up, ears flat, whimpering. On screen, the figure twitched once, violently, and in the blink of an eye, it collapsed. Bones folded in on themselves, limbs snapped back into shape, and Pixie fell into a lifeless heap on the straw floor. Motionless. Tom sat frozen. For the next hour, the screen remained unchanged. No movement, no sound, just static flickers and the faint outline of a creature that was no longer pretending to be what he thought it was. He didn't bother trying to sleep. Instead, he went to the old steel lockbox under his bed, the one he swore he'd never open again. He brushed off the dust, punched in the code, and lifted the lid with hands steadier than he expected. Inside was a manila folder. Worn, creased, stamped in red. Classified. Operation Rain Nest. It had been nearly a decade since he'd last seen those words. Tom had served with a recon unit deployed near Helmand Province, an assignment that officially never existed. During that time, he'd heard stories, whispers really, stories of remote villages abandoned overnight, strange equipment airlifted into classified zones, unmarked personnel pulling strange creatures from crates that weren't labeled and didn't come back out. No one talked about it on record, no one asked twice. But one night, a fellow recon tech had passed him a file, brief, disorganized, half-redacted. It mentioned synthetic hybridization, neuroadaptive field control, and something that stuck with him. Cognitive interface between organism and handler not yet stable. Subject exhibits unpredictable memory absorption and identity imprinting. Tom hadn't known what that meant back then. Now he did. Pixie wasn't just watching, she was learning, absorbing, adapting. He sat at the kitchen table, fingers resting on the edge of the file, pages fanned out in front of him. Names he remembered, coordinates he recognized, notes he didn't understand, and one phrase scribbled in the margins of the final page. Containment fails when empathy is mistaken for ownership. He looked toward the barn through the window. The silhouette hadn't moved, but Tom no longer saw a baby goat. He saw a question, a test, maybe even a message, and deep in his chest he knew something. This wasn't about an accident. It was a return. Something that was never supposed to leave had followed him home.
Dawn was still a rumor on the horizon when Tom stepped into the barn with Shadow at his heel and the rifle balanced across his forearms. The air smelled of hay and cold iron. Frost laced the window panes in pale veins. Pixie lay in her usual corner, small and impossibly still, as if the night's strange contortions had never happened. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the gentle tick of the heat lamp and Shadow's slow, uncertain breaths. The decision was simple on paper: remove the risk, end the question. But nothing about the last week had stayed on paper. It had leaked into the walls, the yard, his sleep. It had found him. He raised the rifle. Pixie didn't move. No braced legs, no flinch, no instinctive flight. Just those flat eyes lifting to meet his. There was no plea in them, no defiance either. Only attention, focus. As if she understood the shape of the choice and was waiting to see who Tom Gallagher was when no one else was watching. Shadow let out a low, aching whine. Tom kept the sight steady, but his hands remembered other moments like this, split-second calls made in places where light and dust changed the meaning of every shadow. He had learned to measure himself by what he did when fear pressed in. Yet what settled over him now wasn't fear, it was recognition. Not of what she was, but of how she had come to be. Built for a purpose, carried too far, set loose without language for the world she had entered. He saw beyond the horror. Not a monster, a product, a task in search of a handler, a signal reaching for the antenna it was trained to trust. Shadow's head dropped until his chin touched the floor.
The sound he made wasn't a warning. It was grief, soft and bewildered, like he knew the ending before Tom spoke it. Tom lowered the rifle. "All right," he whispered to the goat, to the dog, to the quiet barn that had held too much. "We do this the right way." He set the rifle aside and walked back to the cabin. The lockbox was still open on the kitchen table, the folder spread like a thin yellowed map of decisions no one would admit to making. He hesitated only once before pulling an old phone from the drawer, a number he told himself he would never dial again unless someone's life depended on it. It rang twice. A voice answered without greeting. "Go ahead." Tom didn't ask how they knew it was him. "I have something connected to Rain Nest." Silence. Then, "Where?" "Appalachian foothills, private property." "How certain?" Tom looked through the window toward the barn, where the heat lamp drew a small, steady circle of light. "Certain enough. We're 2 hours out." The line went dead. He didn't clean. He didn't pack. He sat on the front step with Shadow leaning against his leg and watched the frost loosen under a growing pale sky. Every so often he checked the barn. Every time, Pixie was exactly where she had been, not sleeping, not restless, present, attentive, waiting. When the SUV came, it came without noise. Matte black paint, unmarked tags, tires that hardly whispered on the gravel. 2 men and a woman stepped out wearing the kind of neutrality you only learn in the corners of a career you can't describe to your family. They moved like people who always knew the next door was locked and always had the key. "Mr. Gallagher," said the woman. She didn't offer a hand. "You called about an asset." Tom didn't argue with the word. He led them to the barn. Pixie lifted her head when the door opened. No panic, no fight. The woman studied the animal with a practiced blankness, then flicked her eyes to the rafters, to the camera, to the hay. She saw what mattered first. It was a skill Tom respected even as it unsettled him. "Containment," she said. One of the men rolled a small reinforced crate from the SUV. Metal mesh, padded corners, latches that closed with a soft final click. They worked without chatter, every movement precise and quiet. Tom stood back with Shadow and felt the dog's muscles gather under his palm, then soften as Pixie stepped forward, almost obediently, as if a silent frequency had finally started humming at the right pitch. When she crossed the threshold into the crate, Tom felt something tighten behind his ribs. He told himself it was the end of a danger. It felt like the beginning of a debt. The woman glanced at the camera feed Tom had set up on a tablet. Her expression barely moved. "You kept your head," she said. It wasn't praise. It was an entry in a mental ledger. One of the men, younger than the others, spoke under his breath, as he locked the final latch. "Second one found this month," he muttered, not quite to anyone. The woman shot him a look, and he fell silent. The words, however, stayed in the air like dust. Tom handed over a small envelope, printed stills from the footage, a brief written account, the dates and times no one would admit to caring about. He kept the original memory card. Not a secret, just a record, the way some people keep letters they never send. "Will she be harmed?" he asked. He wasn't sure why the question came out at all. The woman considered him for a moment longer than protocol required. "She will be managed," she said carefully. "The situation will not return to this address." It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the only one he was going to get. They loaded the crate. Shadow watched, ears tilted, posture low. For the first time in days, he didn't growl. The SUV door shut with a hush. Gravel shifted. The vehicle pulled away and was swallowed by the trees that had always kept Tom's secrets better than people did. And just like that, the yard was empty. No tools scattered, no letters carved into wood, no cold hum in the walls. A clean, ordinary silence returned to the property, as if the place exhaled. Tom stood there a long time, waiting for the heaviness to resettle. It didn't. The frost melted off the porch railing in bright, thin lines. A hawk called from the ridge. Somewhere far off, a creek regained its old voice. Inside, he put the folder back in the lockbox and closed it without ceremony. He didn't throw it out, he didn't pretend it wasn't his to carry. He slid the box under the bed and left it there, not a secret, but as a line. This is where the past lives. It can visit, but it doesn't stay. That evening, he set a pot of water on the stove and listened to it come to a gentle, steady simmer. Shadow stretched in front of the fire and, for the first time in a week, slept deeply, ears relaxed, paws twitching in a harmless dream. Every time the wind brushed against the cabin, it sounded like wind again, not whispers under a door. Tom stepped outside with his mug and sat on the front step. The sky above the tree line shifted from orange to a calm, collected blue. He watched the first star appear and let the quiet fill in the places the noise had carved out. He didn't know what Pixie had been in the end: prototype, messenger, misfire, or something the files hadn't yet learned how to name. But he knew this much: the choice he'd made didn't change the past. It changed him. Some battles don't end when the war does. They just change uniforms and addresses, learn new ways to test who you are. Shadow stirred, lifted his head, and looked at Tom with the easy certainty of a friend who has seen you at both edges and stayed. Tom scratched the soft fur between the dog's ears. "Good call," he said, and he meant it, because sometimes it takes a loyal dog to see what the soldier cannot, and to remind him, when the time comes, which part of himself he still wants to belong to.